Day.
Item number 49, private member's notice of motion number 50, Ms. DiNovo.
Member for Parkdale High Park.
Madam Speaker, before I begin with my motion, just a point of order, I wanted to introduce a friend of mine from for over 50 years visiting from Vancouver here, Gary Crystal. So welcome, Gary. So motion number 50 reads that in the opinion of this House, the following should be included as part of the 2017-2018 and future budget processes to A, incorporate an intersectional gender equity perspective into the design, development, adoption and execution of all budgetary processes, B, develop an intersectional gender-based framework with indicators that will help determine the impacts of provincial revenue tools and provincially funded and operated programs and services on diverse women and various genders during the budget process. C, restructure and target the allocation of public expenditures to promote women's economic opportunities and equal access to productive resources and to address the basic social, educational and health needs of diverse women and gender minorities, particularly those living in poverty. D, conduct reviews of provincially funded and operated programs to eliminate any existing bias against diverse women and gender minorities, working with ministries to develop a disaggregated data collection strategy for the province that will assist in, among other things, assessing the intersectional gendered impacts of provincial budgetary and policy decisions, and E, facilitate at all levels more open and transparent budget processes, including consultations with diverse women, particularly those living in poverty, including those with complex intersecting identities, and gender-diverse members of equity-seeking groups and vulnerable populations, experts in gender-based analysis, and representatives from staff from community agencies serving women and gender minorities to review and advise on the development and implementation of the Intersectional Gender-Based Framework Index.
Ms. DiNovo has moved private member notice number 50. Pursuant to Standing Order 98, the member has 12 minutes for a presentation.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This has been an auspicious week here. We've celebrated 100 years of women beginning to get the vote in Ontario because, of course, it was only white women that got the vote 100 years ago, and our Indigenous and First Nations women had to wait till the 1960s to do that. We also celebrated, I should say mourned, Equal Pay for Equal Work Day because women still don't get equal pay for equal work, and we celebrated the Day of Pink. We also celebrated in 2017 100 years of the women really overthrowing the Tsar in Russia. That was 100 years ago too. And we listened to Malala in Ottawa speak about why it is so important for women to be taken seriously in terms of the budgetary process. Because, as she said, you don't have an economy unless you include women in that economy. You can't progress as a country unless you include women in that progress. And so that's what this long-winded motion is about. It's about doing exactly that. And when we celebrated 100 years of women beginning to get the vote, celebration is as hollow, Madam Speaker, if funds don't follow. Rhymes, I like it. So celebration is hollow if funds don't follow. So this is about following up with funds. And let me remind you about why that's important. If we don't already know these stats, I'm sure most of us are aware of them. 1 in 4 women is sexually assaulted during her lifetime. Women's death at the hands of their partners is almost weekly news in this province. Women lead poverty statistics, housing wait lists. They don't lead the Sunshine salary lists, and that's for public employees. One can only imagine what that list would look like in the private sector. We're still fighting for equal pay. And again, it varies from 50 cents on the dollar to 70 cents on the dollar what men make. We're still fighting for affordable childcare. We don't have it in this province. We're still fighting for seats on panels and boards, and of course, racialized women face double discrimination. We lead temporary workers, contract workers, part-time workers, all mainly women. And this follows on the heels of Kristen Wong-Tam, councillor for Ward 27, who tabled a very similar motion at the City of Toronto, and it passed, and they're into the second year of it. And it follows, by the way, the federal government also at least paying lip service to this at the federal level. We're the only level of government here in Ontario that does not have this as part of their budget process. So it's time to correct that wrong. So the question really is, how does having a gender lens on a budget actually make a difference? What does that mean to take women into account? Let me give you some examples. First of all, the Ontario Child Benefit supports about 500,000 families across the province. The largest group of those who receive the assistance are single mothers. So there's a budgetary promise that impacts some more than others. Ontario has the highest cost of full-time childcare for children across the country. Gender-based budgeting could make that more affordable for women and children. And I'll give you an example of who's done that right in Canada. So in Quebec, where they do have affordable childcare, each $100 of subsidy for childcare paid out by the Quebec government resulted in an additional $104 in tax revenue for the province and a windfall of $43 for the federal government. That's because, if you look at it through an economist's lens and not a bookkeeper's, if you invest, if you put money into social service programs, you see a return, because if you put money into childcare, women go to work and then women pay more taxes. It's a direct result of investment. On a single day here, as many as 302 women and 221 children, many of them individuals of colour and First Nations, are turned away from shelters in Canada because they were full. Gender-based budgeting can improve conditions for those in poverty. In Ontario, we still have about 1,000 trans individuals waiting for transition counselling and health care. And remember, that population has a 50% attempted suicide rate and a 50% poverty rate. So again, looking at a gender-based budgeting process might correct that as well. If you look at the other side of the issue, what doesn't help women, and what doesn't help folk of various genders. Tax cuts. Let's look at that. So tax cuts, as they've been implemented in Canada and Ontario, have mostly benefited men. They don't affect about 38% of women. Whenever we cut taxes on the so-called quotes-unquote middle class, mostly men benefit, because 38% of women do not qualify for the tax cuts that have been implemented by both governments, federal and provincial. And there's less money, of course, available for public services when you cut taxes, and public services are mainly used by women. Women rely on them more than men. Federally, the pension income splitting program cost over $1 billion in 2012, of which 89% was claimed by men. My colleague sitting next to me from Nickel Belt, thank you, brought up a wonderful example of how infrastructure dollars spent can benefit one sex over another, and that is, there's nothing wrong with putting money into bridges and roads, but when you put money into bridges and roads, who gets those jobs? Mainly men. If you put money into long-term care, you're benefiting the women, who mainly are the residents of long-term care, and the women who work in long-term care. Ditto childcare and ditto education, especially at the elementary level. Healthcare generally benefits women more than men. So again, a gender lens on all of this makes a huge difference. And to be aware of our history on this, Canada committed to doing this in 1995. So 22 years ago, Canada committed to doing this in Beijing. With mixed results. This new government in Ottawa has reaffirmed that commitment in many ways, but still, when we look at the results, we're still falling short. So the very first step is at least to make the commitment, and that's what we're asking for here today. I'm going to give you a list. I mean, there are over 200 jurisdictions internationally that already apply this, a gender lens on their budgeting process, and have to and require of all of their ministries that they do this. But just some of the countries, the UK, Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, Scotland, Philippines, Norway, Netherlands, Mexico, Korea, Japan, Italy, Israel, Ireland, Iceland, Finland, European Union, El Salvador, Denmark, Chile, Bolivia, Belgium, Austria, Australia, Andalusia, and Albania. So many, many, many countries use a gender lens on their budgets to try to equalize what, of course, isn't equal in this country and in this province. There are some individual suggestions, too, around that. But, I mean, again, just in a general way, if we're going to ever address our labour issues, if we're going to talk about temporary agencies even, if we're going to talk about how we use our educational institutions, what we do in our healthcare systems, if we don't look at the impact on women, then we're really not dealing with the population that we have before us. And again, you know, it was interesting, Nancy Ruth, Conservative ex-senator, she's now retired. Nancy Ruth was on my panel and on my radio show talking about this, and she gave the example of Vimy Ridge. And this, you know, we just celebrated again another 100 years of honoring those young men who died in that most bloody of wars. But she made the point, she said, when we start to talk about how that formed us as a nation, why aren't we talking about what women have done in history, not just in history, in terms of forming us as a nation? What was women's labour like back then in terms of childcare, in terms of nursing, in terms of working at that time in the factories, in the manufacturing sector everywhere in Canada? Women's labour is often overlooked. And if we don't look at budgets through a gender lens, this gets skewed. And if we don't look at our history through a gender lens, we miss 52% of the reality of that history or history. So again, it's a very simple demand, even if it's a little wordy, and I apologize for that. But it's a very simple demand, and that's simply that this government, who has the opportunity, the rumour has it, the budget is going to be tabled the end of this month, actually goes through it. 27th, there you go. Thank you. So no rumour anymore. No. So now we know. So you have a couple of weeks, my friends across the aisle, to actually look over what you're about to propose and to actually apply a gender lens to that, and to see how it affects women. And by the way, I would ask that you give an explanation of that when you deliver the budget, that you show this Assembly and you show Ontarians how does what you're proposing affect women? How does it affect sexual minorities? How does it affect racialized women? What impact does it have? And I can tell you, and disabled women, absolutely, which is why it's intersectional, a gender-based motion. Exactly. So please, when you deliver your budget, perhaps for the first time in Ontario, take this motion to heart, make this motion so. Don't just pass it, actually use it, actually do it, so that we can hear how it's going to affect us. And if you do, I warrant it will have an impact on poverty, it will have an impact on joblessness, it will have an impact on every aspect of our community here in Ontario. So the ask is not only, Madam Speaker, to pass the motion, the ask is to actually implement the motion. And by implementing the motion, to send a signal to those incredible young women that gathered here yesterday, to send a signal that we really do care about equality in this province and that we really do care about 52% of the population in this province. We care what happens to them. And going forward, we want to affect what happens to us all. Because, as Malala said, without women's health, there isn't any health for a community. Without women's progress, there is no progress. Without women's economic development, there is no economic development. Thank you.